A videotape was sent to CBS television station, and within just a few minutes, alarm bells started ringing loudly throughout the hallways. Instead of seeing the usual funny comedy show that everyone expected, the screen was filled with a very sharp and bold political message that went way beyond anything the television network had ever allowed to be shown before. This was not the kind of safe, gentle entertainment that CBS was used to broadcasting to families across America. Just 6 days after this shocking tape was delivered, the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was suddenly and completely canceled without any warning, without any explanation to the public, and without even a press conference or a farewell episode. The dangerous tape that caused all this trouble never got to be shown on television, but the effects of what happened spread throughout the entire television industry like waves in a pond. This incident started a big fight between artists who wanted to say what they believed and the people who controlled what could be shown on TV. From that moment forward, the idea of free speech on American television was changed forever. Back in the 1960s, American television was completely controlled by just 3 big television networks called NBC, ABC, and CBS. Every single night, millions of families would sit down together in their living rooms to watch carefully chosen and edited programs that followed the moral, political, and cultural rules of the time period after World War II had ended. During this time, CBS was the most powerful of all the networks and dominated the television market with very safe and predictable shows like The Ed Sullivan Show and a Western called Bonanza. These shows never said anything controversial or challenged anyone's beliefs. However, as the movement against the Vietnam War began to spread across the country and a counterculture started growing among young people who were questioning everything their parents believed, CBS realized they were forced to find a completely new way to keep their audience interested and watching their programs. The idea for creating the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour did not come as some bold and daring breakthrough in television programming, but rather as a desperate need to compete with NBC, especially during the Sunday primetime slot, where the popular Western show Bonanza was completely dominating the television ratings and winning most of the viewers. Tom and Dick Smothers were 2 real brothers who had a lighthearted comedy style, where Tom played the smart brother and Dick played the dumb brother. They had been popular performers on smaller television shows and were considered a safe enough choice by the television executives. CBS hoped that these 2 brothers could reinvent the variety show format without causing any serious content problems or complaints from viewers, sponsors, or government officials. The show had its very first broadcast on February 5, 1967. The first episode went very smoothly and stuck to exactly the same format that other variety shows used, with musical numbers performed by guest singers, lighthearted conversation and joking between the 2 brothers, and some simple comedy sketches that would not offend anyone. But behind the scenes, where the television cameras could not see, Tom Smothers had completely different plans for what he wanted the show to become. He did not want the show to just be a simple distraction that helped people forget about the serious problems happening in the world. Under the disguise of humor and entertainment, Tom began to slowly introduce social and political ideas into the show. The seemingly harmless jokes and comments gradually became sharper, more layered with hidden meanings, and more challenging to the way things were normally done. While the executives at CBS were focused only on television ratings and making money, Tom took the opportunity to build what he saw as a new playground, one where television would not avoid talking about reality, but would face it directly and ask important questions about it. Dick Smothers did not object to what his brother was doing, but he was much more cautious and careful about how far they should push things. He played the role of the balancer, the host who softened and made Tom's edgy statements seem less dangerous and controversial. The change in the show's content came gradually, slowly enough that CBS executives did not intervene early to stop it, but quickly enough that viewers began to notice that something different was happening on their television screens. The first really notable guest was Pete Seeger, who was a famous icon of the anti-war movement and someone who sang songs protesting the Vietnam War. Then came other artists like Harry Belafonte, Joan Baez, Jefferson Airplane, and The Who. These musical acts were not just entertainment to fill time during the show. They were making statement songs about war, injustice, and freedom that were being aired during prime time on national television when millions of people were watching. In addition to the controversial musical guests, the show began to hire younger, more politically minded writers, including Steve Martin, who would later become a famous comedian and actor, and Mason Williams. The script for the show gradually shifted from simple situation comedy to satire, which is a type of humor that makes fun of serious subjects to make a point. Humorous folk songs were now interrupted by fictional debates about military policy, the church, and civil liberties. The show kept its familiar structure of music, conversation, and comedy, but the content inside changed completely. The number of people watching the show grew steadily throughout its first season, and it was especially strong among viewers who were 18 to 25 years old. College campuses across the country began to see the show as a voice that represented their views on television. Students began to share lines and jokes from the show with each other as a trend. Meanwhile, many parents and local television stations, especially in the South, began to send angry letters complaining about the content they were seeing. CBS saw that their audience was split between people who loved the show and people who hated it, but they continued to air it because the television ratings were still higher than they had expected. Inside the CBS building, executives began to feel like they were losing control of the situation. Tom refused to change lines or jokes if he felt it was necessary to keep the message intact and honest. Many episodes had to be re-edited just before they were supposed to air, or they were sent out behind schedule because of all the changes that had to be made. Still, the show continued to air each week, adding a new challenge to CBS every time. The second season began with high expectations from both viewers who loved the show and the creators who made it. The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was no longer just a comedy show, it had become a rare television platform for discussing topics that were being avoided everywhere else on television. With viewership steadily growing, especially among younger viewers who felt like no one else on TV was speaking to them, CBS was willing to take risks as long as the show did not push the envelope too far. But what the boundary meant for Tom Smothers was changing every single week. The musical performances that followed continued to push the show beyond everyone's comfort zone. Jefferson Airplane performed a song that hinted at psychedelic drugs, which was a very controversial topic at the time. The Who performed their famous song, My Generation, so loudly and destructively that they actually crashed the sound system during the performance. Meanwhile, Joan Baez caused a huge controversy by singing a song that was dedicated to her husband, who was in prison for opposing military service. Her explanation of why she was singing the song was cut from the U.S. broadcast because it was considered too political. In addition to the controversial music, the comedy portion of the show also began to challenge the media system and the government. Pat Paulson, a comedian who was hired specifically to do editorial segments that commented on current events, performed a series of comedy skits where he pretended to be a presidential candidate. His fake campaign speeches mocked current government policies by making ridiculous promises like, if elected, I will build more potholes to test the patience of voters. The content seemed harmless and funny, but it embarrassed real politicians because it accurately reflected how frustrated people were with the formal, empty promises of politics. But the biggest conflict with CBS came from David Steinberg and his controversial performances. His comedy segments called sermonettes were designed to look like church sermons, but they began airing in late 1968 with a very sarcastic tone. Steinberg turned religious figures into symbols of political power, mixing scripture from the Bible with current events and political commentary. One October 1968 skit was so offensive to religious viewers that several CBS affiliate stations refused to air it, and CBS received more than 300 angry complaint letters in just a single week. The public reaction to these controversial segments was very mixed. Students took notes from Steinberg's performances and wrote them in their notebooks. Unofficial video stores began making copies of the censored clips and selling them to people who wanted to see what had been cut. College newspapers published long articles analyzing the show and what it meant. For many young people across the country, the show was the only American television program that reflected the reality of the world they were living in, with its protests, questions about authority, and challenges to traditional values. The more successful and popular the show became, the more it embarrassed the executives at CBS. The censorship regulations became much stricter and more demanding. CBS required each episode to be submitted 10 days in advance for review by their censors, who would decide what could and could not be aired. Tom Smothers repeatedly violated this deadline on purpose, deliberately taking longer in post-production so he could keep the same controversial lines and messages in the show. The confrontation between the creative team, led by Tom Smothers and the CBS executives, was no longer hidden from anyone. Meetings between the two sides gradually became very tense and hostile. Although it was not officially announced to the public, CBS began to closely monitor every single script and every guest who was invited to appear on stage. Dick Smothers now found himself acting as a balancing force between his brother and the network. He openly disagreed with many of Tom's choices, but he did not publicly object because he knew it would hurt the show. Keeping the show on the air became Dick's personal priority, while Tom's goal was to get the anti-war and political message out to the American people, no matter what the consequences might be. By early 1969, CBS had completely lost all patience with the Smothers brothers. Executives at the network were discussing alternatives and considering canceling the show entirely. Local affiliate stations in the South were threatening to stop broadcasting the show in their areas. Many sponsors who paid for commercials during the show were getting nervous and concerned about being associated with the controversial content. And then, when David Steinberg was brought back for another segment, this time even more direct and political than before, CBS knew that the final line had been crossed for the last time. In early April 1969, an episode of the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour was completed by the in-house production team. The episode had a special element that the show's writers knew very well would cause problems. David Steinberg was back with a brand new sermonette performance. CBS had clearly warned that any appearance by Steinberg after the huge controversy late the previous year would pose a serious risk to the continuation of the show. But Tom Smothers decided to bring him back anyway, regardless of what the consequences might be for him, his brother, and everyone who worked on the show. The performance was set against a very simple backdrop that looked like the inside of a church, with a spotlight focused on a pulpit where a preacher would normally stand. Steinberg stepped out dressed as a rabbi, and in less than 5 minutes, he took the studio audience on a journey from the biblical story of Moses to the image of a modern-day anti-war activist. In Steinberg's performance, Moses was not commanded by God to lead the Israelites across the sea to freedom, but by his own conscience and by young people who refused to fight in a war that was not just or right. The most important part of the segment was a direct line where Steinberg, playing Moses, looked straight ahead as if he was talking to Pharaoh and said, "Sorry, Mr. President, take your army and go, and I will not help you any longer." This line was clearly meant to be directed at President Nixon and his administration's handling of the Vietnam War. The line was met with loud applause from the studio audience, but to the executives at CBS it was seen as a direct attack on the Nixon administration, something they had been trying desperately to avoid for many months. The piece ended with a short musical number where a folk group that was modeled after the famous Peter, Paul, and Mary appeared and performed a song called "No More Promised Lands." The lyrics of the song were about rejecting empty promises from the government and called on young people to stop following the procession of war and to redraw the map of America's future. The scene ended dramatically with Steinberg throwing his religious shawl into the audience and shouting, "Peace, not war! Preach it!" The videotape was sent to CBS as usual, but unlike all the previous episodes, this one was immediately blocked from being aired. Shortly after receiving the tape, CBS claimed that the episode had missed its deadline for review and was in violation of the production agreement that the Smothers brothers had signed. Tom Smothers immediately fought back, claiming that the tape had been sent to the Hollywood censors on time as required. The real problem, he said, was with the New York headquarters, where the review process had been unusually lengthy and slow. In internal meetings at CBS, executives led by William Paley, who was the head of the network, demanded that Steinberg's entire performance be completely removed if the episode was ever going to be aired on television. Tom Smothers refused to make this change. On April 4, 1969, CBS made the final decision and terminated its contract with the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. There was no formal press conference to announce this decision, and there was no advance notice given to viewers who had been watching the show every week. The following week, the show's time slot was replaced by a completely different program called Hee Haw, which was a much less controversial rural comedy show that featured country music and simple jokes that would not offend anyone. The banned episode never aired in the United States, but a copy of it was aired by CTV in Canada, which was not subject to CBS's censorship rules and could show whatever they wanted. The forbidden content quickly became known throughout the country through bootleg recordings and VHS tapes that circulated unofficially among college students, anti-war activists, and people who were curious about what had been banned. College newspapers and youth culture magazines ran detailed articles analyzing the episode's content and what it meant. One newspaper described it as a bitter but worthy farewell for a show that dared to say what others avoided. The public reaction to the cancellation was sharply divided along political and generational lines. On one side, younger viewers saw the cancellation as clear evidence that CBS had sacrificed freedom of expression for political safety and to avoid making the government angry. Small protests broke out in several cities, particularly around local